Picture a quiet street in a Welsh village, somewhere past 2 in the morning. The houses are dark, everyone's asleep, and then the windows start to rattle. Not from wind, from something low and heavy moving over the rooftops in the dark, so close you could feel the air thump against the glass. A woman named Cass Clark is standing in her back garden when it happens. She's a former military woman. She knows what aircraft sound like, and what she's hearing now is the sound of war. Engines screaming low over a sleeping village, then a flat, hammering burst that she would later describe as cannon fire. She looks up, and what she says she saw above the tree line, swaying in the cold air, is something she would spend the next 8 years of her life trying to prove was real. By morning, there would be cracked walls, frightened animals, and a field of dead grass. And by the time the question started, the Ministry of Defense would say the simplest, strangest thing of all. Nothing flew that night. This is the Pentyrch incident. Pentyrch is a small village just northwest of Cardiff in South Wales. Green hills, narrow lanes, woodland pressing in at the edges. The kind of place where the loudest thing most nights is a dog barking 2 gardens over. Ordinary. The last place on Earth you'd expect to become the center of one of Britain's strangest military mysteries. But in the last week of February in 2016, residents say the nights stopped being ordinary. It didn't start all at once. For several evenings running, people reported aircraft circling overhead. Low, persistent. Lights moving over the village in patterns that didn't match the usual traffic in and out of Cardiff Airport. Some folks called the police to ask what on earth was going on. Others just stood at their windows and watched, uneasy, telling themselves there had to be an explanation. Cass Clark had been watching too. She and a neighbor she called Dave had spent those evenings outside, noting the comings and goings, the sense that something was building. And in the small hours of the 26th of February, it broke. The sound came first. Witnesses across the area described the same thing: enormous, low-flying aircraft thundering directly over the houses, close enough that pictures shifted on walls and furniture is said to have trembled. People sat up in bed, convinced something was about to come through the roof. Among the machines residents say they heard and saw that night were huge C-17 transport planes flying impossibly low, and the unmistakable beat of helicopter rotors. Apache gunships, Chinooks, Pumas, the heavy armor of a modern military. All of it apparently converging on a quiet corner of South Wales in the dead of night. And then came the part that turned a noise complaint into something else entirely. Witnesses described bursts of what sounded like rapid-fire cannon. And then a violent boom, an explosion that slammed through the village hard enough that people thought a bomb had gone off. 2 blasts, in fact, reported around 20 past 4 in the morning. One up in the air, one that struck the ground out near a patch of woodland called Smylog Woods. Houses shook. Patients in a nearby hospital were said to have been jolted awake. Some accounts claim the impact was strong enough to register on seismographs in the region. Here's the question that hangs over everything that followed. If the British military was running drills over Pentyrch that night, why were they apparently firing live? And, more to the point, what were they firing at? Because the people standing outside that night say the helicopters weren't alone up there. They say the helicopters were chasing something. Cass Clark's account is the one that goes furthest, and it is the one that has divided people ever since. She and Dave were in the garden when, she says, a large black object appeared above the tree line. She described it as pyramid-shaped, silent, enormous, hanging in the air and swaying gently side to side, like a pendulum that had no business being that size or that quiet. She describes a sudden drop in temperature, bright lights glowing on the underside of the thing, a green object that shot upward into the dark, flashes like lightning, and strange red shapes she could only describe as barrels drifting in the sky. And she wasn't the only one to describe colors and shapes that didn't belong. Over toward the neighboring town of Lantricent, a man named Jacob Coleman reported seeing a green object, caught, he said, in a kind of standoff with Apache gunships. Some miles away, a family in Cowbridge reportedly photographed barrel-shaped objects hanging over their house at around 2:30 in the morning. The timestamp on the images said to line up almost exactly with everything else. Other witnesses described the craft differently. Some said triangular, some said it looked more like a saucer. But the thread running through all of it is the same unsettling picture. Military helicopters at low altitude in the dark, moving with purpose around something nobody could identify, as if they were escorting it or hunting it. For Cass and Dave, it got stranger still. She says they suddenly couldn't move, a paralysis holding them in place. Their phones went dead in their hands. A green light passed over them, and when it was over, when they finally came back inside, the clocks told them something that made no sense. They believed they'd been outside for around 15 minutes. The clock said an hour and 20 had gone by. Lost time. More than an hour of it, simply gone. And then, she says, the strangest detail of all. Over the following day, a single strand of her hair turned white, then more, as though something out there in the dark had reached into her body and aged a part of her overnight. Now, the pyramid, the barrels, the paralysis, the missing time, the white hair, all of that rests on the word of the people who say they lived it. None of it was caught on film in a way that settles the matter. It is testimony, extraordinary testimony. But when the sun came up over Pentyrch, witnesses say the village did not look the same. And that is where this story gets harder to wave away. Because something, that morning, had left marks on the ground. Locals reported that a field lying along the path the object had supposedly taken was scorched and dead. Grass turned brown. And here's the detail that stuck with people. Trees that were dead only on one side, the side that had faced the object. The other side, untouched and green. People described strange pellets on the ground too, like snow that wouldn't melt. Out in Smilog Woods, 6 tall trees were reportedly found snapped clean, broken off around 20 feet up in a straight line, as though something massive had come down through them. To the people who found it, it looked like a crash site. A house in the village was said to have a cracked wall. The ground itself was reported to be vibrating, and in the fields beneath that flight path, farmers reported animals dead or driven into a panic by whatever passed over them in the night. And then there was the human activity, which is in some ways the eeriest part of all. A dog walker out early that morning reportedly saw helicopters landing and men on the ground. Troops sweeping the fields with metal detectors at 4:30 in the morning. Scattered scrap metal out on the common was said to have been gathered into neat, deliberate piles. There was crime scene tape. Roads were closed, including a stretch of the M4 motorway with the official explanation given as an overturned truck. Then a small camp of tents appeared behind Cass Clark's house. The men in it, she says, were not in uniform, but they were armed. When asked what they were doing, the story kept changing. First it was a survey for fracking. Then it was Vodafone, checking a phone mast. Some, witnesses said, were dressed in full protective suits, the kind you wear when you don't want to touch what you're handling. People who wandered into Smilog Woods to look around reported being stopped by armed men, searched, and having the photos wiped from their phones. And at Cardiff Airport, an Apache gunship reportedly made an emergency landing with a fire in the cockpit, said to have taken off from a nearby military base at 4:24 that morning. The official reason given was a mechanical fault. So here is where the village stood the next day. Dozens of people who'd heard the aircraft. Cracked walls and dead grass and frightened animals. Soldiers searching the fields. Tape across the woods. Roads shut. By any reasonable measure, something enormous had happened over Pentyrch. And then the people who'd lived through it started asking the obvious question. They went to the authorities and they said, "What was that?" What they got back is the reason we're still talking about it. The Ministry of Defense's first answer was a flat denial. There were no military aircraft operating over Pentyrch that night. None. The thing that had rattled the windows of an entire village, the thing dozens of residents had heard with their own ears, officially, it never flew. Think about how strange that is. This isn't one person claiming to see a light in the sky. This is a whole community that heard heavy aircraft hammering over their homes, called the police about it, watched furniture shake, being told, politely, that perhaps they'd misheard ordinary civilian traffic, that perhaps they'd imagined it. But when investigators kept pushing, the official story didn't hold still. It changed, because this is where two researchers enter the story, and they would not let it go. Their names are Steve Mera and Mark Ollie, investigators who took the Pentyrch case seriously when plenty of people were ready to laugh it off. Working alongside Cass Clark's own years-long campaign of Freedom of Information requests, they spent months on it, gathering testimony, cross-checking accounts, lining up the timings, knocking on the doors of the official bodies who might know what really moved over that village. They published their findings in Phenomena magazine, and what they assembled is far harder to dismiss than any single story of a hovering pyramid. Because the cover-up, it turns out, is more solid than the UFO. Watch how the denials shifted. Having first said no aircraft were present at all, the MoD later admitted there had been activity, but now hid behind exemptions for national defense. The body that oversees Britain's air defenses reportedly stated there were no planned air defense exercises anywhere in South Wales that February. So if it wasn't a planned exercise, what was a fleet of gunships and transport planes doing over a Welsh village at 2:30 in the morning? At one point, officials reportedly pointed to something called Exercise Chameleon as the explanation. Except, the investigators found, Exercise Chameleon had taken place a week earlier, and in northern England, hundreds of miles away. The explanation didn't match the map. Then there was the paperwork. A notice to airmen, the formal warning that tells pilots an area will be active, was reportedly found filed for that night, but logged at around 9 in the evening, just hours before the operation, when the normal lead time is around 5 days. As if it had been thrown together at the last second. And the aircraft, it was claimed, had flown some 50 meters outside even that hastily drawn boundary. The body that owns Smilog Woods, where the trees were found snapped, said any activity like that on their land would have needed permission, and that they held no record of granting any. The military's own rules require weeks of written notice before exercising on private ground. None, it seems, was given. And the institutions that touched the case kept tripping over their own accounts. The local hospital reportedly told the story 3 different ways. First, that they'd had no warning at all, then that they'd been told of a police counterterrorism exercise, then an apology citing new information, quoting an email they later said they didn't even have. South Wales police, asked again and again, 11 times by one count, kept landing on the same careful phrase, neither confirm nor deny. The force's own chief reportedly stated there had been no counterterrorism exercise on those dates at all. And the journalist who'd posted some of the earliest coverage of the incident, coverage that quietly vanished, reportedly went on to take a communications job at that very same hospital. Every thread you pull leads to the same knot. A denial that doesn't survive contact with the evidence. An explanation that points to the wrong week and the wrong country. Paperwork filed in a panic. Bodies that should have records and don't. And others that have records and won't share them. And Cass Clark, the woman at the center of it, says the pressure didn't stay on paper. 2 days after that night, she reports, a black SUV nearly ran her off the road. She says she was followed. She says military personnel turned up at the talks she gave about what happened. She also says that in the years afterward, medical tests showed signs of radiation exposure and an unusual electrical signal coming off her nervous system, and that she passed lie detector tests about what she'd seen. her own account again. But an account she has never backed away from, not in 8 years. So let's lay the two explanations side by side, the way the investigators did. On one hand, the down-to-earth version. The pyramid was really a formation of those huge C-17 transport planes, flying low and close together, their dark shapes blurring into one triangle against the night. The strange red and green objects were drop zone markers, or flares, hanging under the aircraft. The lost time was adrenaline and shock playing tricks on a frightened mind. The dead phones were the Apache's powerful radar jamming nearby electronics. A military exercise, badly handled, flown low over the wrong people. Embarrassing enough that the easiest thing to do was deny it ever happened. It's a reasonable story. It explains a lot. But it doesn't explain the gunfire. It doesn't explain why an exercise would be flown with no permission, no notice, and live explosions over civilian homes. It doesn't explain the snapped trees and the one-sided dead forest, or grass scorched in a line, or animals dropping dead in the fields. It doesn't explain why every official body asked about it gave a different answer, or no answer, or an answer that fell apart the moment anyone checked it. And it doesn't explain the thing that started all of this, the reason the helicopters were up there at all. Because in a military exercise, there's no enemy, nothing to chase, nothing to fire at. And the people of Pentyrch are certain they heard their own Air Force firing at something in the dark over their rooftops. So that's where it rests, 8 years on. A village that heard a war in the sky, cracked walls and dead grass and frightened cattle by morning. A stack of official denials that contradict each other and contradict the people who were there. And a woman with a white streak in her hair who has never stopped asking, the one question nobody in authority will answer. Not whether the noise was real. Everyone agrees on the noise. The question is, what was at the other end of those guns? Did an entire Welsh village really watch their own military open fire on something that didn't come from this world? Or is there some ordinary thing, something we just haven't named, that can shake houses, snap trees in a line, and kill livestock in the dark, and then make every record of it quietly disappear? I'd like to hear what you think really happened over Pentyrch that night. Leave it below. And if you want to keep walking into the cases that were never closed, the ones the official story can't quite cover, stay with us here in the dark. There are always more.